YouTube's Made for Kids should not be read as family-friendly on targeting, COPPA, and the FTC. Hello and welcome to another episode of Virtual Legality. I'm your host, Richard Hoeg, managing member of the Hoeg Law business law firm of Northville, Michigan. And today in Virtual Legality, we're going to talk about a little bit of a blind spot that I think lawyers can have and that people that regularly deal with statutes and regulatory code can have. And that's in respect of simplifying the language a little bit. So one of the things that has popped up in respect of COPPA, and this all happened when YouTube started asking its content creators to check a box that says, yes, this content is made for kids, or no, this content is not made for kids, is that the people that are trying to figure out which box that they should check are perhaps reading it differently than both YouTube and the Federal Trade Commission intended. So as part of that discussion, I want to talk about a few things that I saw on my social media in the past 4 or 5 days. Because like I said, this video is about blind spots. And as a lawyer, I could see what YouTube was doing. I have read the order, I have read the complaint, I have read all of the COPPA rule many, many times now at this point. If you're familiar with Virtual Legality, you know we've covered the rule itself in many occasions in this series alone. But ultimately, while I can read it and I can see what they were trying to accomplish, the fact that they didn't do such a great job is very easy to kind of go over the head of YouTube, even go over the head of myself a little bit. And I'm seeing this confusion out there that I just hadn't anticipated. And so I wanted to clear a little bit of it up because I think it is important. So we've pulled up now a Twitter string from a couple days ago, and it's from a Twitter person called Mohammed Mosaha. And he says, "So Team YouTube, I'm under pressure to specify whether our content is made for kids or not. Our content is for mixed audiences, and I don't want to kill our channel by choosing made for kids. What's the solution?" Now, there's a couple things happening here, but one is that people are using the concept of mixed audiences in a colloquial way, like you would expect, just talking to somebody out in the world, saying, hey, my stuff is for everybody, it's mixed audiences, what should I do? And the Federal Trade Commission and the COPPA rule, which we've talked about at length before, but which we're going to pop into in this video as well, has a bit of a different definition for that. It's actually something else. And so we are having a bit of language issues when talking to one another. Team YouTube says, hey, general audience content, you'll note they don't use the term mixed audience because that's actually being used right now as a term of art, is intended for 13 plus. So if you create content that is targeted to a general audience, you can set your audience as not made for kids. Parsing out that sentence, YouTube is actually saying something fairly complicated, but which gets kind of glossed over if you're just reading it not so carefully, as one does on Twitter. They say it's intended for 13 plus. They don't mean it's aimed solely at over 13 plus. They mean if there is a component that's aimed at over 13 plus, you fall under this general audience bucket, and COPPA shouldn't apply to you. Now, they can't make any guarantees, just like we can't make any guarantees here, but it shouldn't. When we go look at the rule, we'll see why. A video isn't necessarily made for kids, quotes, their button, just because it's safe, appropriate for everyone to watch. And that's the other piece of glossing that YouTube has confused in their language. We're going to take a look at their advisory blog post on this. But by changing the phraseology from directed to children to made for kids, I think they have subliminally added in this concept that if you say, no, it's not made for kids, that in the normal world, the world that is not YouTube buttons and COPPA rules and the Federal Trade Commission, when you say something is not made for kids, you mean that it is inappropriate for kids. And that's not what that button means. That button, in fact, means it's not directed at children. It means not made for kids literally. It is not aimed at kids. But people don't see it that way, and that's what's popping up. So this Twitter thread continues, we create content for everybody, not just for kids, but we have kids appearing in the videos, which is a consideration according to COPPA. I'm lost at what to do. If I choose for kids, then that kills our channel, which we've talked about in previous episodes of this series, is a decision that YouTube made separate from the Federal Trade Commission, but that's a different discussion. I highly recommend checking out the rest of the series if you want to hear more of my thoughts about that. But that is kind of the consideration here. If I click that button as for kids, then I'm in trouble. If I don't click it, I'm a little bit worried about the Federal Trade Commission. And YouTube is trying to clear things up but the vagaries of the language that they have selected is making things more difficult. And then you have Creekcraft come in here, and Creekcraft says this is directly contradictory to what the FTC told me regarding general audience content. Now, general audience content isn't the same as mixed audience content, so Creekcraft is confusing those phrases just a little bit here. But they say in order to meet the mixed audience exception, which is a subset of for kids, now he's got it right there, you must not collect data before prompting the user for their age. The not for kids option does not do this. As we've talked about in the series, the checking of that box doesn't change Google's operations really at all. What it does is say if you are for kids, then they're going to turn off all their buttons for collection of behavioral advertising data and persistent identifiers and everything else. Clicking not for kids allows Google and YouTube to operate the same way, and there is no option to set up an age gate. There is no option to say mixed audience because YouTube didn't want to offer that option to everybody. Creekcraft comes out here and says the FTC contradicts what you just said, YouTube. But that's in fact not the case, as we've just talked about. So Creekcraft, if you're not familiar, is a YouTuber that actually has spent a fair amount of time going over all of this. And I think they've done a great job in talking over these issues, actually going to the Federal Trade Commission, having these conversations with people, and delivering good, intelligent news to their viewers. Now, ultimately, this is all a very technical, legal, conceptual issue. And I think even the Federal Trade Commission, as we've talked about, can only go so far as to say what they can and can't do under the Act and what they are asserting, whether or not that's permitted under the Act's rules itself. But what Creekcraft was able to go and do is talk to these Federal Trade Commissioners. He got some answers on the mixed audience age gate that we've talked about. And when YouTube says that, they come out and say that the Federal Trade Commission has gone the other direction. But that's not the case. As Creekcraft then later corrects later in the day, he says, hey, I asked an attorney at the FTC about this, actually at the Federal Trade Commission, and I'm happy to say I was wrong. YouTube is correct here. If your content is for general audiences or mixed, you can mark your channel as not for kids. So that's that, I guess, problem solved. And then I chime in, as I'm wont to do. I say, hey, that's a good disclaimer that I'm not a lawyer. But in terms of the actual question, the boxes are best read as directed to children and not directed to children. If we look at the actual consent order that the Federal Trade Commission put out there, that is what YouTube was supposed to have created with this mechanism. For kids is a pretty terrible shorthand for that, I will say. Looking at the consent order, it says, failing to develop, implement, and maintain a system for channel owners to designate whether their content on the YouTube service is directed to children is what they are supposed to do. I've cut this out a little bit, and everything in a federal complaint or order is essentially reversed. So this enjoins, this prevents YouTube from not doing that. And if that's too many negatives for you, it basically orders YouTube to make a system that allows creators to check directed to children or not directed to children. And what YouTube has instead done is they have shortened directed to children to made for kids. And I think by doing so, brought in all of that kind of subconscious awareness of what made for kids means to people. And so that's one of the things that is really confusing folks. If you are not targeting, if you are not directing your content to children 12 and under, you should be able to click the no, it's not made for kids button. And that doesn't mean you've got gun running and sexual content and swearing and all these other things in it. It means what you have created was not aimed solely at the 12 and under set. And that pops out a little bit more if we actually look at the COPPA rule, which again was promulgated under the Act itself. It says, hey, a website or online service directed to children means a commercial website or online service, or portion thereof, that is targeted to children. Obviously, not a ton of definitional help there, but that's the primary definition. Before we even get into the other paragraphs, directed to children means targeted to children. Children here being the age of 12 and under. If you target your content at that set, then you have to click the yes, it's made for kids button. If you don't target your content for that set, you shouldn't have to click that button. Again, we can't make guarantees here because the Federal Trade Commission has asserted a whole lot of authority over quote-unquote operators and other definitional sleights of hand that I don't think are supported by the Act or even the rule language in all cases. So the Federal Trade Commission could come out and make life difficult for people. And we still have the issue of the fact that They are interpreting targeted to children based on this kind of ambiguous set of things in paragraph 1, where we see in determining whether it is directed to children, we'll consider subject matter, visual content, animated characters, music, child celebrities, etc., the list of factors that we've seen discussed at the Federal Trade Commission level, in Virtual Legality, and elsewhere. And that list is ambiguous enough that you still wind up in this kind of discussion with people on that Twitter thread that say, hey, I've got children in my videos. It's not aimed at the 12 and under set. What are you going to do, Federal Trade Commission? And in all honesty, the Federal Trade Commission can't give you a good answer on that, because all this says is we will evaluate everything on a facts and circumstances basis, and you don't know what you don't know. So if we evaluate it as directed to children and you didn't hit the box that we like, then you've also used YouTube to collect data in violation of COPPA, and hello, welcome to a Federal Trade Commission action. Now, we've also talked in this series that I don't think that's particularly likely. They haven't brought claims against content creators or content feed providers on Facebook or elsewhere before, and one of those reasons is that the website operator definition is really, really tricky to bring in a litigation setting. So they want to make sure that if they've got somebody, it's going to be a case that they can definitely win. But with that ambiguity, you find yourself going through the paragraphs and saying, okay, so I don't know whether I fall under paragraph 1, but when we get to paragraph 3, which is what we are talking about when we talk about mixed audiences, it only applies if paragraph 1 would otherwise put you in the yes, made for kids bucket. Paragraph 3 says a website or online service that is directed to children under the criteria set forth in paragraph 1, but that does not target children as its primary audience, shall not be deemed directed to children if it uses age gates. So looking at this from a legal perspective, what this whole thing actually says is you have to target children in order to fall under this definition. We will deem you to have targeted children if you meet this subject matter visual content requirements that we haven't decided yet, but we'll decide on the day when we look at your channel. However, even if you would fall under that bucket, if you also actually appeal to a more generalized audience, you don't target children as your primary audience, then you can use an age gate. YouTube isn't offering that age gate, so paragraph 3 right now isn't a useful safe harbor for people. So the ultimate determination is, do you actually target your children? And unfortunately, the COPPA rule doesn't give a lot of context here. That's what this entire debate and discussion has been about. But what's confusing the issue even more is this button. Is this determination and this language that YouTube has used? I've pulled up now a video that I did recently, and just to show you, if you haven't seen it before, what this looks like for a YouTube content creator, where it says, is this video made for kids? That's the question. Is it made for kids? And it's so easy for someone that isn't watching Virtual Legality, isn't reading the COPPA rule every day, or looking at the Federal Trade Commission's press conferences to say, yeah, I mean, it's made for kids. It's appropriate for kids. I don't swear. And that could be something as adult-oriented as a 1-hour analysis of a Buffy the Vampire Slayer episode in 1996. It's made for kids because it was on broadcast TV. I don't swear on it. We have a fun conversation. There is nothing that should be offensive to a parent. It's essentially answering the question in the negative, and YouTube has encouraged that by adding this ambiguity to what the language should have been. There's really no reason why they should have changed the language from directed to children to made for kids. I don't think that directed to children, directed being an active verb kind of phrasing, would have the same kind of issues that we are seeing on Twitter, in social media, with YouTube content creators. If you followed this series, you know it's a rare thing for me to really compliment the Federal Trade Commission on its language, or even the legislature on the COPPA Act language. And I think directed to children actually does do a better job than what we are seeing from YouTube. Directed is very much different than made for. And if I were in YouTube's shoes right now, I would change this to almost certainly align with what the Federal Trade Commission has required, what the COPPA rule and COPPA Act requires, and actually say directed to children, and children are the age of 12 and under, or under 13 if you'd prefer to phrase it that way. But instead, they've encouraged people to try to figure out whether they can say something that is family friendly, is not made for kids, And I think it's really confusing people, and I don't blame them one bit. Going a little bit further, we see that YouTube doesn't actually offer help here. They mostly repeat what the COPPA rule says, that says, hey, determining if your content is made for kids. According to the FTC's guidance on COPPA, a video is child-directed. They actually use that language correctly here, which we call made for kids, if children are the primary audience based on those factors, or children are not the primary audience, but the video is still directed to children based on the factors below. Now, they've confused that issue even further, right? Look at that second bullet. Children are not the primary audience. They are not being targeted, but the video is still directed to children based on the factors below. How can anybody that isn't a legal scholar, or maybe isn't even a commissioner on the Federal Trade Commission, because maybe they're the only people that can possibly read this and know what it means, how can anybody interpret that second bullet as allowing what YouTube says in their own tweet, that, hey, if you've got things that are aimed at more than just the 12 and under set, you can click the Not for Kids button. That's what they told people, because that's what you are allowed to do under the COPPA rule. But the factors confuse things, because frankly, the Federal Trade Commission hasn't been great about delineating between directed to children, mixed audience, and general audience, either in the rule itself, the act, or their comments to the rule. If there were anything that I would clean up about COPPA, it would be getting a very clear hierarchical difference between these various gradations of obligation. And unfortunately, YouTube has confused the issue with their own language. They've confused the issue a second time by trying to shorten that language. And the FTC is doing them no favors by saying one thing in a very specific way, talking about mixed audiences and age gates, saying another thing when talking about general audiences, which don't require age gates because presumably the factors won't apply, and confusing everybody in the process. YouTube can do a better job. The Federal Trade Commission can do a better job. But if you take nothing else away from this video, take the title away. Made for kids does not mean family friendly. Don't read it in the negative. Don't read it the way you want to as a human being using plain English. Try to read it like the Federal Trade Commission, YouTube, the COPPA rule writers, and everyone else. What it means is made for kids literally, directed to those kids. Not just that you don't swear, you don't have strippers, and you don't have pictures of guns. This has been Virtual Legality for today. If you like this, please like, please subscribe. We're talking about these kinds of things all the time. We've got an entire playlist called YouTube at Large, which dives into these things. If you didn't catch it, we put up a video late last week, really late on Friday night here on the East Coast, called The Other Side. A lawyer looks at the arguments of COPPA's strongest advocates, which I highly recommend, which actually dives deep in one of the primary comments that was done by a whole mess of advocacy groups that really kind of outlines what YouTube content creators are acting against. The people on the side of the For the Children folks and COPPA rules being more stringently enforced on YouTube and content creators. If you're at all interested in that discussion, I highly recommend checking it out. Otherwise, if you caught this on YouTube, thank you so much for watching. And if you listen to it in its podcast form, thank you so much for listening. And I will catch you on the very next episode of Virtual Legality. Virtual Legality is a YouTube video series with audio podcast versions presented as commentary and for education and entertainment purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. If you have legal questions about the topics discussed, please consult your own legal counsel.